Welcome to Going Deep. Brandon Angelo at Angelo_fantasy at Matt Waldman here. And listen, if you haven't checked out Brandon's subscription service, you're missing some stock up, stock down emails and some ascension data on Tyrone Tracy over this past month. Definitely check that out. The RSP, we just put out the June update for the projections and Dynasty rankings, and I made that available even to the rookie guide subscribers as at least a free month for them to look at that as their version of the 3-year ranking. So you can check all that out at mattwaldman.com, and gave you a little bit on some running backs that I think are worth looking at heading into 2025 in terms of things that you should be checking out about them to see if their stock's going to go up or down. But this week on Going Deep, talk a little bit about what we define as a sleeper and some guys that may wind up being sleepers in terms of the various archetypes of sleepers that kind of exist out there. So, one of those, just to get right into it, is the sleeper archetype of the guy who fell in the draft because half the GMs apparently, or execs, took him off the draft board. That's according to Greg Bedard, when the Patriots beat writer, who talked about Javon Baker, saying that he was apparently off the draft boards of half the execs that he spoke with. So, you and I have both talked about how much we like Javon Baker. Fine route runner, certainly has had some moments in camp where he's made some big plays already. So what are your thoughts on this whole idea of where he is on draft boards, whether there's fire with that smoke, or overall just kind of feeling about what we should be watching out for with him?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I heard the same thing that Bedard said, and I was reading some of the articles that were surrounding that particular item with Baker, and a lot of them were like about his dad, which is kind of interesting. So I thought that was really peculiar, because you and I both did extensive work on Baker's archetype, what his makeup is, he plays X receiver primarily, but he can move inside and bump in the slot. There's a lot of great things about his game as a wide receiver, but I never really saw any of that. Like in my deep dive of Javon Baker, I think his personality is a little more can be seen as abrasive if you kind of listen to him speak about his game. And but that's kind of goes along with playing the position at a high level, especially that position. So I didn't see a flag with that, but yeah, I think it's interesting that Bedard said, basically 15, 16 teams took him off their draft board. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see how well, I think, a guy like him, if there were legitimate character concerns, how he feels about playing a complementary role to start. Like what is his character, his ego going to be when he's asked to learn and grow? Because that's an offense too, where there's going to be a lot of learning and a lot of growth in the Patriots offense. It's not an offense that's going to hit the ground running. They don't really have any established playmakers besides Ramondre Stevenson. So that's going to be interesting to see who steps up in that room, and who gets some early career opportunity. I think Polk is one of those guys I think can contribute pretty early on, has the makeup too. And, as we talk about stock up, stock down, and with all the subscribers I have last week, I said Polk might be kind of an Amon-Ra St. Brown in a sense, where he's one of those extensions of the run game, and he kind of does the little things right that you kind of just want to get him the ball because he doesn't make very many mistakes. Guy like Javon Baker, a little less mistake-free. So that's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be a guy that's going to continue to ascend and to continue to make plays and grow into a larger role in that Patriots offense.
Yeah, I think that if you compare the two, Baker probably has more highs and a higher ceiling than Polk does.
For sure.
And that I think he's a more technically sound route runner, but the mistakes at the catch point can be a bit of an issue with him. And, to touch on the whole thing with the dad, it is fascinating, and it's unusual to hear about this, but I have certainly spoken with people who've told me in the past that there have been past issues with players where their families have been such a problem, like that they come up to the facility and cause a ruckus with the staff, When it comes to like, maybe something being an issue, and they try and come in and talk to their son or their nephew or whoever
Sure.
that player is related to them by, and they end up like being disruptive to the day to day of the actual franchise operation because
Right.
of what they're doing, and they're creating a distraction for the player to where they're not it seems like they're not getting to put in the level of work that they're capable of putting in because the family's creating such a distraction overall and so much drama.
Right.
And I mean, it sounds crazy, but there are a lot of people out in this world who have like narcissistic parents.
Oh,
you, you
100%.
know and those parents can be like, if they're not the object of attention 365, they can be really problematic for that, and they can cause a split between that kid and whatever it is that's important to them, because they feel so much insecurity as parents or relatives that they feel like that if they're not the absolute that kid's not the extension of their needs, then they make that kid's life hell. So it's if that's what Baker's going through, that's an issue, but it may just be the fear of that being the possibility.
Yeah.
That's the other end of the spectrum, is that it could easily just be a fear without really great feel for what the truth is. In the same way that they could look at Jimmy Smith and say, oh, he was a horrible character concern because he smoked a little pot to medicate. But
Sure.
then if you did the deeper dive, you realized he was a great kid. And a
Yeah.
lot of teams took him off their draft board. And I'm sure Patrick Mahomes' dad was probably seen as a negative.
Yeah.
And
No. a
Lamar
100%.
Jackson's mom was seen as a
Yeah.
negative.
Yep. Yep.
And look how that
Caleb
turned out.
Williams, another one. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's just one of those. It's one of those like odd ones where it's like it usually never has that profound of an impact. I mean, the
Yeah.
bigger ones I think in sports were like LeVar Ball, right?
Yeah.
With the Ball brothers. But besides that, it's like it's really rare to see that plays that profound of an impact
Yeah.
in professional sports. But I'm not thinking much of it, especially with him. He's a day 3 guy, right?
Yeah.
This is not like he was a first round pick, and if he's not playing, your mom or dad's march into the front office and give something to Robert
Yeah.
Kraft. Like that's not
Good
I
luck
don't think
doing
that's
that in
gonna
New
happen.
England, but
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, but no, I think Gerard Mayo's gonna, he has high expectations for the kid and all the rookies in particular, because that's a pretty talented rookie class that he gets in his first year as a head coach. But I think he'll be just fine.
Yeah, I kind of half think that guys like Greg Bedard probably see the world in a certain way, or are used to seeing the world in a certain way. And when there are players that don't fit their cultural biases, that
Yeah.
they end up probably making more out of it than need be. And I don't know, maybe that's unfair to Greg, but we've seen that before. So we've seen guys go off on Colin Kaepernick over things that were just silly, well before the whole kneeling thing, which personally I thought was silly, but especially with three kids who are veterans who basically would say to me, nobody gives a fuck about this.
Sure.
In the military, 2 Army, 1 Marine, and they were all, and an in-law who's a Marine, son-in-law is a Marine, and they were all like, nobody cares about this except some ex-veteran football fans who live for this stuff and are violating some of our codes of conduct anyway, the way they wear flags and display things that really don't matter. So I don't know. I just, a little bit of that, it could turn into fire, but right now I just see it as smoke,
Yeah.
So
Sure.
So let's talk about sleepers anyway, because Baker obviously is a sleeper. The character part may have been what dropped him, I guess,
Sure.
and leaving Alabama and having a star elsewhere. But how do you define a sleeper? You know, because
That's a good question.
you look at people out there, and it's like I joke. There's like the lunchroom table crowd of people who like who a lot of them are really good. So I'm just making fun of y'all. Like Matt Harmon, I think is part of the lunchroom table. He's
Sure,
great.
sure.
We love him. You know, he's my friend, and I have massive amount of respect for him. But if I'm going to poke fun at him, I would say he fits the stereotype of the Peaky Blinders haircut, beard oil sponsorship, you know, craft beer, what I'm eating,
Sure,
what
sure.
I'm lifting, what I'm talking about, podcaster, that everyone aspires to want to be, or at least it seems like a big part of the population wants to aspire to be. And I would say a lot of those people are talking about folks who are inside like the 15th round. You know, Dontavian
Sure.
Wicks, he's a sleeper.
Yeah.
And I go, well, yeah, I guess he is a sleeper, but to me, if to me that's not a sleeper. If the people who only follow that crowd of fantasy analysts can spell his name while inebriated,
Hey,
after the 15th round,
that's a qualification. That's a standard you just set. Oh man, I think honestly, I think for me, what kind of quantifies the sleepers is someone the fan like even like the diehards of the fan base have very little information about or just understand who the player
yes,
is.
yes,
Like in the past, I'd say guys like Philip Lindsay, James Robinson, you know, I don't know if you can classify Puka Nakua because I think most people knew who he was.
right.
At least like in the you know, in the fantasy and dynasty circle, you kind of knew who he was.
Yeah.
He had good metrics.
But
Right?
would you but from the people who want to who want to basically mask their insecurity for not being sure that they know enough, if you picked Puka Nakua in the 16th, 17th, 18th round last year, did you get people saying good pick, or did you get people saying who's that guy? Do you want my list? So that you know those people who
Oh
are
yeah,
trying to
that's kind of funny
you
because I
know,
think you got a combination of both.
yeah,
You know, in one of my leagues, it's just you know just it's a vampire league. It's with a bunch of my bunch of my friends, my cousin's husband's in it, and he's a great dude. But it's all these dudes from like the East, and I'm a Midwesterner, and I picked Puka Nakua. It was a redraft league, and someone commented, they're like, "Is that a Pokemon character?"
right. See what I'm
And
saying?
I'm like,
Yes.
I'm like, is that like a dig, or are you asking? Are you genuinely asking if that's a Pokemon character? And so it's just like stuff like that. It's kind of funny, but like you know, guys like I said, like James Robinson, like Jill McLaughlin would quantify, you know, like Austin Eckler, right?
Yeah.
Some of those guys that are really under the radar dudes, like you know, Adam Thielen, like those are true sleepers to where their own team doesn't even know they're that good yet
Yes.
until they get on Sundays and prove it, right? So I think those are the guys I think that quote unquote are sleepers, that their own team, your own fan base doesn't quite have the understanding of their level of talent.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I would add parameters like probably guys drafted after round 17
Sure.
are, you know, and a lot of leagues don't go that deep, so there's that. Um, guys that guys that we're not even sure the team thinks that they would give them a full workload if they were to inherit the starting role. Like Kyron Williams
Right.
last year was a perfect example. I
Sure.
think, you know, he was a known commodity. He went to Notre Dame, but then by year two, he was all but kind of a forgotten man. And people were like, well, Zach Evans is a hot name now. We also have some other guys that might spell with him, you know, in that backfield. I mean, Cam Akers is still considered the guy. So really, Kyron Williams, you know, that kind of thing. I would think even guys like Jaden Reed last year were probably picked
100%.
after 17 rookies who like the draft nicks knew, but there's guys that people look at and go, yeah, maybe in a year or two, but too soon, you know, and then they end up being something more. And then I think guys who wind up in that range who can deliver at least 5 weeks of consecutive consistently strong production, like starter or flex caliber production. Like Darius Slayton to me would be a sleeper last year, mainly because of how late he went, or DeMarcus Robinson, how late they were
he's a good
available.
one.
And you got 4 to 6 weeks out of them. That was like, okay, Darius Slayton was wide receiver 16 for like a 5-week period.
I know. Zay Jones, another one. I think it was that was 2 years ago with Zay Jones, and he had that monster stretch. But I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think this year is going to be a ton of those guys, and there might be some guys that before weren't sleepers and now that qualify, right? Like guys like Rashad Bateman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
The guys who are kind of afterthoughts, and we'll talk about him later probably a little bit. But Michael Thomas,
yes,
right? Guys who were extremely relevant, and now they're more bordering on irrelevant.
Yeah.
And get in the right situation, and they might be a sleeper. And one that I think that's not a sleeper per se, but someone I think that you got to circle him every single year is Brandon Cooks.
Yes,
like
sure.
Dallas didn't draft another playmaker.
Yeah.
Outside of having CeeDee Lamb, you have Jake Ferguson.
They're hoping for Jalen Tolbert. They're hoping.
Yeah, you're hoping for Jalen Tolbert. And you have kind of a after that you kind of have a hodgepodge receiving core.
Yeah.
But Brandon Cooks is going to be he's going to push for 100 plus targets. And this is going to be a pass first team.
Yes.
They don't have an established running back besides Zeke Elliott. You're not going to rely on him and the rest of their, core of backs to give you, consistent production. So I think it's going to be through the air with Dak Prescott. And one of the guys who's going to be a beneficiary of that is going to be Brandon Cooks, who seems to have 1,000 yards every single year.
Yeah. And another one who's a backup version of that, who you just say, listen, if I'm drafting 18th, 19th, or 20th round, and I don't take Noah Brown and he's there,
sure.
Why am I not doing that? Considering the rapport he's shown with CJ Stroud, the multiple opportunities to a path for opportunity because he can play multiple roles, and what he did with those opportunities when he got it. So it's like, yeah, I understand that you may be using up a roster spot for a reserve, but that's a reserve I want to have because I know the minute he gets plugged in, he's going to produce.
No, you're 100% right. Because I think simply, what if 2 of the 3 guys get hurt?
Yeah.
Right. What if Diggs and Dell or Collins, 2 of the 3 get hurt? Right?
Yeah.
This is a very pass heavy team.
Yeah.
And CJ Stroud's a year older. He's going to elevate his game even more. And yeah, I think it's really funny because one of my good friends, he's called Noah Brown fake CD. We'd be watching the games, and I have Sunday Ticket. I'd put it on my computer, and he'd be like, "Did fake CD score the touchdown, or was it actually CeeDee Lamb?" Like, I have no idea because they're both 85, 88.
Yeah.
Similar build, so it's like kind of hard. But I think Noah Brown's actually one of those guys that if he wasn't on the Texans, he could be a complimentary receiver on most NFL teams.
Yeah.
Like, he is one of those guys that he's solid at everything. He's not elite at anything, but he's good enough to see the field in 3 receiver sets on a lot of NFL teams.
Yeah. Atlanta really could have used him, to be honest. Like, when you think of
100%.
A team, or Pittsburgh, who's looking for that extra receiver now.
Yeah.
That's going to be fascinating. But before we get to Pittsburgh, let's stay in that AFC North and talk about Cincinnati, because Tee Higgins certainly, it looks like they're going to probably at some point, next year, probably he'll be gone. They're not going to re-sign him. So maybe they trade him at midseason. Maybe they'll try to do that. And the thought is, you look at, Jermaine Burton, and he's probably the in-crowd's favorite sleeper if we're going to go outside the boundary.
Sure.
He's a sexy pick, and deservedly so. But then there's Andrei Iosivas. I think that's how you say it. And out of Princeton. And one of the things, you always get he worked with the trainer stories, and those can get people too excited. But I know that trainer, Drew Lieberman. He's been on the RSP show a number of times, And Drew Lieberman is the foundation. His work with receivers and how he defines techniques is literally the foundation for what I filled up on this board a few years ago to recreate my criteria and either
Sure.
validate or add to it for how I evaluate receivers. And it really changed how I've done as an evaluator of the position. I give a lot of credit to him. And he's worked with guys like Brandon Ayuk. He told me last year about Dontavian Wicks. He was like, listen, this guy can be a starter in this league. I'm working with him. Just give him a year or two. He's going to be a lot better than where he's drafted. I really like him. Work with Julian Edelman, guys like that. And apparently, Andrei Iosivas saw Drew Lieberman's work and said, I want to work with him. And he worked with Drew, and Drew was like, he and Chase Brown, because he told Chase to come with him. And he said, Chase, come down here and work with Drew with me in Atlanta. And they worked together, and apparently in The Athletic, Drew's talking about how, they were two of the fastest learners he's ever worked with. And he says, and part of the thing was that neither of them really had much knowledge base of route running. So that might have actually been working in their favor because they didn't have any bad habits to undo. He said, but they really improved fast. And Chase Brown, he was like, really, I'm going to work with a running back. This guy's going to be totally lost. He said, but Brown worked so hard, and now he looks like a receiver. And you're starting to see things like that. And I think with Iosivas, as an outside presence with the speed we know he has, could he be really the tipping point for Tee Higgins ending up getting traded away mid-season if you combine him and Burton?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because you kind of brought up a good point with Iosivas, because I think you look at his size, his speed, just the athletic makeup, and just the raw ability he has and brings to the table. If Tee Higgins is gone, let's say he is at midseason, who else do you have? Charlie Jones and Jermaine Burton and
Kwame Lassiter the second.
You don't have a next guy up. You don't have a second option. I think Iosivas can push for that, and I also think too an interesting part of what I hope that offense becomes is without Tyler Boyd, there is that slot position opens up. And either they're going to be moving Jamar Chase around much more, which I think would be beneficial, or a guy like Iosivas has kind of that big slot role in some packages and really can just find his footing in the league. Because that's going to be a big one, right? Just get him on safeties, linebackers, slot corners who are a tick slower than him. Just create mismatches with the guy. So that's going to be something that you kind of watch, because Jermaine Burton could slide in that role as well, right? I think Jermaine Burton's a guy I'm drafting in every single draft.
Yeah, me too.
So I do think Tee Higgins is gone next year. I think Jermaine Burton is a better version of what Tee Higgins can bring to the table because more multidimensional, can bump inside, better after the catch than Tee Higgins is, and, has proven durable, which is, I think, the biggest thing with Tee Higgins is the lack of durability, right? Is he going to be healthy for the playoffs? And that's the question that you don't have the answer for with Tee Higgins. Some years, yes. Some years, no. But that being said, there is a significant opening. If Tee Higgins is midseason, gets traded and whatnot, gets his deal, then there is significant targets open up in that offense, because it's not just going to be Jamar Chase with 220. That's not how it's going to work. So there's going to be a second and third option. But is it going to be Burton Iosivas? Is it going to be Burton Charlie Jones? I like Charlie Jones too.
Sure.
I liked him coming out of Purdue. I thought he was a really interesting player that could play in the slot, and I think he might get an opportunity to be the first guy up in that Tyler Boyd type role. So he's definitely going to – he quantifies as a sleeper and someone I'm keeping my eye on as well.
No, I love it. So just as a follow-up, you brought up Tee Higgins and injury. Then I think of Mike Williams and injury. And they're both kind of big ball-winning guys at the boundary. Is there anything to that, to the person who might ask that question and say, do I need to keep an eye out for some of these old-timey ball winners at the boundary who don't have maybe complete route games at the level that a primary would, that I need to worry about them more?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I think the answer to that is yeah, because I think, the larger you are, larger framed human being you are, right, the more mass you tend to carry. The more mass you tend to carry, the more force you produce. The more force you produce, the more strain it puts on your muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, etc. So I think that's why the misnomer of small guys get hurt. Actually, bigger guys are more prone to injury than smaller guys are, in my opinion, especially when talking about the soft tissue variety. Like guys like Devontae Smith have had a much healthier career so far than a guy like Tee Higgins, who's very opposite prototype in terms of build. But yeah, I think you look at, past injury is the biggest predictor of future injury. But I think you also look at build, archetype, how they move, right? Are they fluid movers, or are they choppy or more abrupt, and just things like that. But I think it's hard to just say this body type means more injury. But I think larger framed players, especially at the receiver position, need to take more care of their bodies and need to take more steps than a guy like, let's say, Devontae Smith, who's not outputting as much on a down-to-down basis. But also, too, so that's before, this comes with, the sports science and medical staff being the forefront of operations of those guys, right? Those guys need volume restrictions on a practice basis, right? When you talk about daily allotment, and if you have a 90-minute practice and Tee Higgins is running a total of 3 miles in back-to-back days, well, that's a recipe for disaster. And that's why a lot of injuries happen. Just simple overuse of the tendons, joints, ligaments taking such a pounding on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's a bigger one for me.
That's a great answer, and what that really tells you too is that maybe how you approach that from a practical angle is you want them to prove to you that they've figured it out, that they figured out how to take care of themselves. Because I remember my buddy of the program, Eric Stoner, former contributor, would joke. He said, "I'm waiting for DK Metcalf to run out of his ligaments, basically to just like run right out, basically separate his hamstring from his bone at some point during his career, at least early on, because you thought, wow, this guy's too big for his britches, basically, as an athlete. But so far, he's been pretty good. He's been pretty good at keeping it together.
He's kind of one of those freak athletes, man, because he talks about eating like Skittles and all this stuff, and like his diet is basically candy. It's crazy, but yeah, I mean, a lot of times like you got to look at previous injury, but also to like build an archetype, like Saquon Barkley, for example. Like he was one when he came into the league with just how erratic he was as a mover. I mean, absolutely spectacular guy. And Sean Miska, Movement Miyagi, he does a great segue on this too, in segment, I should say. But with Saquon, nothing was really preordained. Like everything was in the moment and spectacular. Like the spin move, just the dead leg, just the D cell, the A cell, just the multi-dimensional capabilities the mover he had. There's also a danger to that when you're 230 pounds.
Yep.
That's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
So he's not making those cuts and at Jahmyr Gibbs weight.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of the difficult part is, yes, you can do that, but there's a time constraint to that if you don't figure out how to make those movements more fluid, more controlled. But lack of control is a big one there too. But yeah, I'm not gonna ramble on about this, but it's harder to definitely for larger framed athletes. It's definitely harder to stay healthy and durable consistently just because of what your body's being asked to do down to down.
No, without a doubt. And I think that's worthwhile, is that there's something to it, but you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis with these players and go from there. Well, let's stay in the NFC North and talk about a smaller player. A guy that, at least when I watched him at Memphis, Calvin Austin, to me, was in the same kind of physical archetype as Wan'Dale Robinson, but I thought was the better player. I thought
Sure.
he was better against man-to-man coverage. He was capable against man-to-man coverage. You could put him on the outside and he could win contested plays. And he was a little faster than Wandale was. And Wandale was pretty fast. Pretty quick, too. And Austin made a little bit of noise early on this time 2 years ago, where they were like, wow, this guy can really move, and they really were taking note of him, but he couldn't stay healthy. And then last year, he had some moments on the field where he made a couple of big plays, but really didn't establish a foothold. And part of that, too, is that it was a rotating carousel. It was a carousel of quarterback ineptitude. So, could Calvin Austin be the true sleeper in a receiving core where, Roman Wilson is considered the guy that's going to determine whether or not Pittsburgh gets a veteran receiver this summer. But to me, is Calvin Austin more that option? What does that say? Where do you look at Roman Wilson at this point in his career and compare him to Calvin Austin? And why? And do you feel that way about Austin, or do you feel differently about him?
It's interesting because I think Calvin Austin's similar to Tutu Atwell. Build, obviously speed, explosiveness, just ability to kind of win the ball too at his size. But the difference between Sean McVay and Arthur Smith is motion and creativity. Arthur Smith is not the most creative play caller, right? We've kind of figured that out, especially with his lack of usage of Bijan Robinson. That was a big one. But also, too, like if you kind of look at what Arthur Smith likes to do, everything's kind of predicated off the run. So like Najee Harris and company there are going to get a lot of looks in the pass game too. If Arthur Smith took a page out of Sean McVay's playbook, they're going to motion the heck out of Calvin Austin, utilize him, kind of as that movement Z receiver, use him across the field. Really hard to stay with a guy like that with his explosive capabilities after the catch. But that's going to be something too. Like Arthur Smith's going to have to reinvent himself in a way to utilize Calvin Austin in a sense where he can be a playmaker for that offense, because he absolutely can be in some situations. Roman Wilson's kind of your dirty work receiver, I would say. Great blocker, physical, reliable in a sense. I don't think he's a world beater of a talent. Didn't produce much at all at the collegiate level, but he's someone that Arthur Smith might prefer because he helps the run game as an extension of the run game, right? He's going to be able to, motion in and pick up a backer, right? Just things like that where he can be on the field and you don't have to worry about the situations because he's able to be serviceable in the areas that Arthur Smith likes to play with it. But I mean, if it's me, I would much rather prefer Calvin Austin if I'm a play caller, because he just opens up so much from a dynamic standpoint. But I think Arthur Smith, he likes his Mac Hollins type players, right?
Yeah.
But I think he prefers that over, your Calvin Austins, your Tutu Atwells.
And that makes sense. The only defense I could possibly supply to Arthur Smith is that Desmond Ridder was so craptastic as a quarterback that you kind of had to.
Nice. That's putting it nicely.
You had to pare down your offense on a certain level to make things simple so that he didn't screw things up, which means maybe he had to fall on his sword as a play caller and look really bad because nothing was dynamic, because his quarterback couldn't handle that dynamic ability to adjust and make plays without making a lot of mistakes. And maybe he felt saddled with Ridder, by year 2 and said, wow, this isn't working and we have nobody else that we feel really strongly about. Let's just keep it simple. But then you go back to Tennessee, and could you make the same argument with the quarterback there to a lesser extent? Maybe so.
And the receiving core, take a look at it too. Wasn't all that good.
Yeah. So, we'll see. This may be the true test where we get to see for sure whether or not it's Arthur Smith being just this staid, dyed-in-the-wool conservative of a play caller and scheme tacticianer, or whether or not he's like, no, now that I've got some tools to work with, maybe we'll do a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's a great analysis because yeah, it's true. I mean, Austin to me, it could be Tutu Atwell, but maybe the other side of that equation could be Doug Baldwin. Maybe it could eventually he could be a middle class Doug Baldwin to Russell Wilson in this. I think it's a bit of a stretch if we at this stage for that to happen. But when you're trying to project what the ceiling outcome could be, there's some of that's possible with his skills paired with Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
Especially if they do get that next receiver. And maybe that receiver's Michael Thomas. If you think of a place where he could be a good fit, Arthur Smith wants to throw the ball, target the middle of the field. Michael Thomas is a stud in the middle of the field. But you could imagine, now again, we're stretching the bounds of Arthur Smith's abilities here based on what we've seen. But, if you did motion Austin around, or you motioned him and Thomas around so that Thomas was kind of the boundary threat in the red zone, you allow Austin to be the play action vertical threat up the boundary on the play action looks and post routes, and then Thomas is more inside more often. You get the run game blocking that he's capable of, and then you get the tight end plus dynamic route guy who can win one-on-one from the slot. That would really help Russell Wilson have a guy that he hasn't had since he was in Seattle anywhere even close to on par.
Right.
So do you like the idea of him there, or do you think I just invented a wish casting alternative reality and my feelings won't be hurt on that? Where do you think he winds up?
No, it's funny because I do think they're going to add somebody, right?
Yeah.
We've kind of seen the smoke with Brandon Ayuk. If that ever comes to fruition, I don't know. But I do think with George Pickens and adding someone larger bodied receiver, right, who could play inside, that makes it a lot harder for defenses to key on Pickens. And he's the guy in that offense at receiver, right? So I think in that capacity, it makes it easier for Russell Wilson. It makes it easier for George Pickens to do his thing, especially vertically.
Yep.
Right? It takes pressure off him to make a profound impact on the first and second level, because really he's a vertical receiver who has to understand the game within the game at the first and second level that he just hasn't done yet, right? Yeah. That's a learning curve for him. Learning from one of the best middle of the field receivers in the past decade, I think isn't a bad thing for him in that offense. Yeah. So I think it's definitely something that could happen.
And it frees up Pat Fryermuth a little more too. On
the
opposite
he could be I was gonna say he could be a big time seam threat. And it does a lot for that offense, I think, to add someone like that, who might be kind of at the apex plus of his career, right? Yeah. And might just be more of a one-trick pony in this sense, but it's a good trick. I think for that offense, it makes sense to me. It's one of those interesting ones where I think he might wait for a contender to have an injury or something like that. So let's say like Mike Williams goes down in New York and the Jets are hot and Rodgers needs another target he can trust. That's a vet. He's someone I think they would call on.
Yeah.
Just teams like that, the Bengals make sense too if, they want to move on from T or T's hurt and they're making a push and Burrow needs a second option other than Chase. Yeah, sure. But I think in terms of like the near term, the Steelers make a lot of sense too.
Would Atlanta be one if Atlanta got hot? Kirk proves that he's healthy enough to keep rolling and that he doesn't have the issues you talked about, and then he can stick it to the Saints twice a year?
Maybe. I think, in looking at that offense too, I think, Darnell Mooney's he actually signed for a good bit of money too.
Yeah.
So I think he's actually a viable second option. I don't know. I think, it could be one of those Julio Jones to the Eagles type deals where it's like, the end is near, but he can make a couple plays for you in the red zone and in his situation. It just really depends on how much he has left, and what his legs allow him to do.
Yeah.
Like he's just been, ever since his initial injury, it's been downhill for the last 4 years.
Yeah,
So
he's played 20 games, and in those 20 games, I think he's caught 90 balls for 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns, which is good, but it's 20 games in the past 4 years.
yeah, especially for where he was, because he was, him, Antonio Brown, Odell, Julio, kind of at that apex at receiver. Probably missing one or two there, but those were kind of the guys. 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see where he goes. I think he does get signed somewhere. Mid-season makes a little more sense, but somewhere with an injury or a team just looking to add a veteran, make a push. The Packers come to mind too. They're kind of they don't really have any veterans. I mean, all their receivers are pretty young. Romeo Doubs is probably might be the most senior.
Yeah,
as a starter,
and maybe not the most seased either.
Yeah,
which is
I know, 100%.
Yeah.
But I think a team like that could make sense to add a veteran presence to the room. But like you said, the Steelers, they're one that does make sense in the interim.
I like the Jets suggestion.
Where it goes.
I think that's probably the
Jets
wisest
make sense.
suggestion. Yeah.
We don't know how healthy Mike Williams is going to be, right? He's past his prime. He's coming off an ACL. Already he's battled multiple injuries throughout his career. So, it's going to be who can slot in that type of role in that offense that Rodgers can trust right away.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Well, let's wrap this up with a few young guys here that we've kind of really just been talking about young wide receivers this whole time, but let's go back to them after a little break with Michael Thomas there. But Tre Tucker with the Vegas, with the Raiders.
Sure.
Parker Washington, second-year player out of Penn State with Jaguars. And Casey Washington, the Illinois product, the Illini guy with Atlanta, who Drake London says is lighting it up in camp.
Yeah.
Parker Washington has established more rapport, and they feel like he looks like a little bit of a different player. And I thought he had nice rapport with Trevor Lawrence last year. And then Tre Tucker, who looked like he was coming on at points. Well, Antonio Pierce says he looks like a completely different player because he addressed his hands. And Tucker, like Scott, the other Cincinnati speedster receiver, Tyler Scott. Both those guys were in that tier for me in last year's draft as guys that you're like speed, toughness at the catch point, plenty of yak to go around, but they had the fatal flaw of how they attack the football. And like if they don't figure that out, they're just promising athletes. If they figure it out, they could be like legitimate fantasy assets and legitimate starters. Tre Tucker apparently addressed that, and they're like, he looks like a totally different player, and he's pretty much the favorite to be the number 3 option in that receiving core. So I think Tucker's the one that's most impressive to me, because when you have a fatal flaw like that and you've addressed it so far that you're already making that impression, that's promising. What are your thoughts on any of those 3 guys?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I've heard glowing reviews like you had on all 3 of those dudes. Tucker is interesting because the role is going to be a question mark, right? Because you add Brock Bowers to the equation, right? And there's always there's 2 big target owners, and obviously Myers and Adams already. Bowers gets added, so you're looking at a fourth guy.
Best. Yeah.
In a Antonio Pierce, run it down their throat.
Yeah. 2 tight ends, possibly. Yeah. Exactly.
Like persona. So that'll be interesting to see, what happens there and how it shakes out. But I wouldn't be surprised if he starts in 3 receiver sets. For sure. Parker Washington's the one I want to look at the most. Because I liked what I saw last year after I think it was Kirk's injury. So I think he might be the odds-on starter over Brian Thomas Jr. I think he's more ready to play than Brian Thomas Jr. And if he takes another step, I mean, you have Kirk and Ingram, and there's not really that third option that's solidified.
Gabriel Davis doesn't do it for you?
No, you know what? I think Gabe Davis is going to play a good third level role. but the inconsistency I think is going to be there throughout his whole career.
Yep.
Parker Washington can play multiple positions. I think he can be a threat as an extension of the run game, kind of similar to Robert Woods in a way. I think that can kind of be the Walmart archetype of Parker Washington potentially, which is still pretty good. So I think that's someone that can contribute in Jacksonville. In Casey Washington, another Washington, in Atlanta, I've heard really good things, and obviously that Illinois offense wasn't very good in college for him, but they don't have an established third receiver. So if he starts earning some playing time towards, down the stretch, or if, Darnell Mooney goes down at some point, he could be someone that slots in there and be a serviceable player.
Yeah, because who do they got? Scotty Miller, Ray McLeod?
That's it.
After Darnell? Yeah, not much.
That's it. Yeah, so we'll see. But I think all three of those guys are interesting. If I was going to put a priority order, Parker Washington's someone I'm drafting in every league.
Yep.
I just don't, I think outside of Kirk and Ingram, this is going to be a wide open battle for the third target getter in that offense. So he might be one to definitely take a deeper look at.
I would agree with that. And we got to remember, like, when you look at Parker Washington and Gabriel Davis are kind of like opposites in the same role, like in some respects, because what Trevor Lawrence does extraordinarily well when he has talent around him to support it is he buys time. He can buy time, and he has the gun and the chutzpah to fit the ball into tight windows. And some of the plays that he made last year, in between the mistakes that caused his stock to drop in the eyes of the media, some of the plays he made were pretty extraordinary. There's a couple of plays that I've watched last year where I was like, that was the type of throw those are the types of throws that earned him some of the buzz that he had pre-draft.
Oh, 100%. For sure.
And, part of it too was he had receivers drop balls, not run great routes, not be on the same page with him. Gabriel Davis is the guy that, like you said, third level beats the defense that climbs too far forward on a misdirection play or climbs too far upfield when the quarterback's under pressure and the quarterback escapes and now Gabriel Davis is drifted behind him. That's how he wins. But like you said, dropping the ball is always going to be an issue with him. And he needs to be schemed open too much. Whereas Parker Washington can get schemed open and be that extension of the running game, as you mentioned, but he's great against zone coverage. He's a really savvy player who you could see him becoming that security blanket off script with Trevor Lawrence, because not only is he great off script and good at moving around and finding those open zones and getting yards after the catch, but he is a contested catch monster.
Yep. That's a big one.
Yeah, so you can drift him behind a second or third level of the defense and still get him, but he can also make those tough, tight window plays and get yards after the catch with that. So even if he's the third option, technically, maybe they force feed Brian Thomas in there due to draft capital, they put Parker Washington in the slot or alternate him with Christian Kirk based on just like, think of speed, flanker type of like dimensions. He could wind up being the second or third leading target getter on this roster and wind up being the long-term guy like the Hines Ward type of player for Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, it's in the realm. I think, and you kind of hit the nail on the head, is there's not another Parker Washington in Jacksonville right now.
Yeah.
Because he's the contested catch guy in that offense. Like he's that archetype of player that's going to make the difficult plays look easy, and that's not Brian Thomas Jr.
No,
that's the thing is I don't really know where Brian Thomas Jr. fits in this equation, because I think the passing game revolves around Christian Kirk. Evan Ingram is going to be also a big part of it, right? He had had over 100 targets, 115 targets.
Another Drew Lieberman reclamation project right there.
Love it. But he's developed into a pretty fantastic tight end, and he has some staying power in the NFL. So that those two guys obviously, and then you kind of have the giant question mark is who's going to step up and be the third. And my bet is Parker Washington.
Yeah. Well, my bet is that you should check out what Brandon has to offer. Angelo_fantasy on X. Angelo Analysis. You can find Matt Waldman's work, whoever that guy's talking in third person is. We're talking about wide receivers. It just kind of caught on.
That was a good transition. That was an A+ transition, man. I'll give you that.
See, there you go. So, it's summer. I just had COVID, and, I'm talking in third person like a wide receiver. But, I'm getting into character. Next week, we'll probably look at running backs, or next time we get together, and I'll be a little more selfless. But, but you can check everything out at mattwaldman.com. And thanks again, everyone, for listening. Another great show from Brandon, and thanks again, folks, and congratulations on him. It's a little personal, but new parent again. Or not new parent, but a parent to a newborn,
seasoned veteran at this point.
Seasoned veteran, that's right. So he is going to become a master of zone coverage very quickly.
Absolutely, I have no freaking choice. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. Well, we'll see if we can give some advice on zone blitz and fire zone tactics. But thanks again, folks, and happy 4th to all y'all.